The amount of effort that you put in is more important than what exercises you pick for muscle growth. Hey, everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I thought I would chat with you guys and gals a little bit about this today. But if you guys would please click like and drop me a comment down below, I'd appreciate it so much. All right, let's get over to this topic. This is one of those where this is pretty well supported by tons of evidence. This has been observed by experts. It's been observed by plenty of bodybuilders for pretty much generations. But when you start looking at a lot of the research, we start finding that as you get closer to failure, weights go up, progressive overload goes up, volumes go up, particularly volume with proximity to failure. Muscle growth tends to be fairly complete in muscles. Okay? And people lose sight of this fact. I feel like they absolutely lose sight of this fact, and then they'll say, well, how come, if that's true, then why does this person have this lagging muscle? Well, it's genetics. So, and I think that point has to be made when it comes to your proportions. If you train everything equally, you're not necessarily going to have the same proportions as someone else. And I think people forget that. So when we have this conversation, people will say, well, if that's the case, then why don't you have amazing biceps compared to the rest of your size? This actually, my biceps kind of proved the point, actually, right? Because what's one of the few muscles that I have isolated to a massive extent? My biceps. I think that's worth noting there, right? If we looked at how much isolation work I've done for any given muscle in my body, in the entire time you guys have seen me making content for 13 plus years, what muscle has gotten more isolation in my body than anything else by a large metric? My biceps, right? They've gotten way more isolation work over the years, particularly like the last 5 years, than any other muscle in my body. So again, if we ran over to this, well, if you just isolated mind muscle connect focus and that's what's going to grow, well, then why don't I have amazing biceps? Like, why are they not disproportionately big compared to the rest of my body? Because it's just not true. It's called genetics and structure. But that being said, so just think those things through. And I think people forget that. Like, I literally actually kind of proved the point. I could be used as a textbook example in a lot of ways for that, right? Now, that being said, when I make this statement too, I know some really good natural bodybuilding coaches who say similar stuff. They're just like, look, stop trying to fix weak points. Your genetics are your genetics. Just train everything. And they will say that, look, your genetics are going to determine your structure. And even if you want to go compete in bodybuilding, your genetics and frame are going to determine your best class, right? All bodybuilding, and women is even more diverse than men's at this point. There's so many divisions, even in, say, the natural and even the enhanced, that a lot of people can land in a lot of different places, okay? And it's largely your genetics that would determine which particular type class you're going to do best in, okay? Because your proportions and other stuff are going to be based largely upon your genetics and frame and other stuff, limb lengths, right? So you take a guy like me with longer arms, you're going to struggle to have proportionate biceps no matter what you do. And then there could be other factors. But the point we're making here is when we look at data, we start seeing that as volumes go up and proximity to failure go up, even your big compounds grow all the muscles involved, okay? And we're not saying individual heads don't get left out. I'm not telling you to never isolate anything. I'm not even making that statement. But we're simply looking at the reason you might isolate something would realistically be because something in your program isn't hitting it, okay? I mean, a perfect example would be, hey, if you're focusing really hard on dips and chin-ups, your side delts might be getting the least stimulus out of any muscle in your upper body, so throwing some lateral raises in would make a little sense in that case. But what if you were doing a compound movement that actually hit the side head harder? What if you were doing an upright row? Well, then that goes away. What if you do behind the neck presses? So let's say you have the mobility to do a behind the neck press, not just a regular overhead press, but the people who can really get back there. Well, now we've got something. So what if you're doing dips, chin-ups, and behind the neck press? I mean, pretty much every muscle in your upper body is getting pretty solid stimulus at that point. And I'm just giving that as an example, right? If you were unbalanced training that way, it would be due to genetics, not due to the training, assuming you trained them really hard, right? Would everything be getting maximum growth? No, not necessarily. But if you took the volumes up high enough, it would. And I think this is what people forget. With enough sets, close to failure, high quality reps. Because when we start looking at this, what do we see even in the big movements? As we get heavier or we get close to failure, even EMGs show higher and higher activations for everything, right? It's not proportionate. And I think that when we talk about certain muscles getting better work from specific exercises, it's usually with less effort, right? That's what we have to understand. I mean, even EMG studies, muscle growth studies, everything, it's usually only looking at low volumes and sub-failure sets. Because when you remove those things and the volumes go up, you start training to failure, it's a different ballgame. You don't get any real lagging muscles in a lot of the stages. Everything starts balancing as far as what's being worked on your big movements. And it's the same thing with different types of curls. Yeah, we have different studies even looking at the bicep with MRI from an incline curl versus a preacher curl. But then when it's been noted, is it really bicep difference or is it because the brachialis gets worked more? It's a separate muscle getting more work. But what happens as soon as multiple exercises come into the equation? Well, if you start adding rows or pull-ups or whatever to that, well, then the brachialis, other stuff's going to get more balance. And at the end of the day, ultimately, you're going to find that as long as you're training really hard with sufficient volume, with it, especially with bigger exercises in the mix, everything is getting pretty well stimulated. Okay, so if you're having disproportionate development, it's usually, at that point, it's usually just genetics. It's just your genetics. Okay? And that's fine. We just deal with it and move on. Just keep training. You can't change those things.